So I've been asked to say something about legislation, of course, and I must apologise straight away because I do have to shoot off straight afterwards. So I guess if there are any questions or queries, Shamir will be happy to take them and answer and respond accordingly. And feel free, obviously, to pass on my contact details if anybody wants to do that. So I'm just going to say a little bit about some of our findings, really. And by our, I mean sort of my team that I've sort of got together, which is fantastic, mainly young people who volunteered and who are paid to do work on this subject area. Lots of enthusiasm around changing this scenario entirely. So those of you who know me will know that I've been focusing on Section 54 on transparency in supply chains. And I think it's one of those pieces of legislation that people point to as being a game changer, something really significant, and undoubtedly it has helped to raise awareness in quite interesting ways by encouraging people to talk about things they might not have talked about before, companies to kind of, as it were, confess to challenges and barriers that they might not have talked about before. And that's all been very useful. It's made people look at the risks much more closely. However, it does have notable weaknesses. One of which is there's no punitive measures, there is no effective government or other kind of monitoring, and compliance with Section 54 is very poor by and large. Now, for those of you who may have forgotten or don't know or whatever, Section 54, transparency in supply chains, requires any company with a turnover of £36 million or more to report on what it is they're doing to try and eliminate modern forms of slavery from their supply chains. And people have interpreted this in various ways. Some still seem to think it's enough just to say we have zero tolerance for slavery. And that's it, that's the statement. And or we only trade in Britain with British suppliers and therefore there can't be any problems. So there's still an awful lot of work to do around making this a really effective piece of legislation. Again, as many of you will know, I've introduced a private members bill, which the main plank of which is to say that public bodies should be included. To me, that's a real weakness of Section 54, that public bodies don't have to produce a statement of what it is they're doing to eliminate modern forms of slavery. And I think that's particularly pertinent to the construction industry, where we have masses of these huge infrastructure projects being undertaken. Some bodies have taken it upon themselves to produce statements, even though they're not compelled to do so, like Transport for London amongst them. But by and large, you know, it's only a minority of local authorities, etc., who've done so. So that, to me, could be a real game changer. Excuse me. So where are we 3 years after the Act came into force? I do think it's time for the government to step up. And what I'm hoping is that the opportunity afforded by the Home Affairs Committee scrutiny of the whole Act and by the independent review of certain sections of the Act, including Section 54, by the MPs Frank Field, Maria Miller and the peer Elizabeth Butler-Sloss. I'm hoping that those two sets of inquiries/scrutinies will enable the government to feel a bit more backbone and strengthen that legislation to make it much more effective. Because I think if we don't, we'll be disappointed, and a whole heap of businesses simply aren't reporting. About 50% of businesses still haven't filed a report, so they're actually breaching the law. Some of them who filed reports haven't been compliant with the requirements of the Section 54. Indeed, some of the companies that are employed by government aren't fully compliant with Section 54. So how come we've reached this situation, having claimed to have produced this wonderful, groundbreaking, leadership enhancing piece of legislation, when we haven't done the simplest of things about it? It's also the case that the government kind of holds this position that it's up to the public to monitor what goes on with companies, and I would argue that that is really unacceptable and in fact totally unfeasible in any real sense, because people don't have the knowledge. You may know who's on the high street, like your local supermarket and so on and so forth, might be able to identify them. But particularly, again, when it comes to the construction industry, who knows who's made the pavement that you're walking on, or the railings, or, you know, is operating on those building sites. So there's a huge amount of work still to be done. I would suggest that, particularly for public bodies, there are a number of benefits, and I think some of those benefits had been identified by some of the key movers and shakers in the private sector, and they include the benefits of looking at risk management, ensuring compliance with international guidelines and collaboration. There's lots of potential benefits from doing the work in this way. And of course, I know later Sue's going to talk about the example in Wales, which is a code of practice. So Wales are way ahead of the rest of us on this particular subject. Just to go through very sort of briefly some of our main findings from our analysis. We've got to the stage where, you know, you sort of feel like if I have to read another modern slavery statement again, I'll go mad. And one of my researchers got very depressed at reading a whole bunch the other day because he said they were so poor. And this is, we're talking 3 years after the legislation. So again, there's that point. We do need to somehow to monitor, not necessarily to assess in terms of give scores, but to at least have a common set of a sense of a framework within which we can say, well, this particular statement does pass muster. So to start with the positive, I guess what we've found is that looking across a whole range of sectors, not just construction, the sections where the companies score reasonably well, and that, as I said yesterday, the bar is set very low, so when I say reasonably well, it's not that fantastic. But the risk management, staff training and due diligence, those are the sections where people seem to be able to at least produce something that's credible. But worryingly, the lowest scoring fields in all the TISC statements are the slavery and human trafficking policy. Now, so this suggests to me that what organisations are doing are looking at the list in the guidelines, the list of headings. They're cherry picking the ones that they think they can answer easily and which there'll be little blowback if they get it wrong. And then they're not really taking the spirit of that legislation, which is, yes, to produce a report to say what you've done and what you intend to do, but also how you're going to do it. So if you haven't got an underpinning policy, if you haven't got a policy framework within which that report sits, you know, I'm not saying it's useless, but it isn't doing the job that it's intended to do. So to me, that's a very important lack. That's what we're finding in statements is one of the biggest lacks, because there's a danger then it just becomes a tick box exercise. Oh, we've written a report, we say we don't like slavery, we say we do our best to get rid of it, and off we go, and we can reproduce that the following year. And that's another thing. We're not seeing the advancement, we're not seeing progress year on year. It's early days, but early indications are that we're not seeing the kind of progress that we would want to see and that would help improve practice. The other key issue that is not appearing in those statements in any meaningful way is how you evaluate effectiveness. If you say we can guarantee there's no modern slavery in our supply chains, which some companies do actually say that, you know, how can you guarantee that? You know, have you gone beyond tier 1? I mean, how far down the chain have you gone? Are you including transportation if it's goods? And are you including services like security, cleaners, the supplies of technologies? How can you guarantee that throughout every supply chain with which you're connected, there's no form of modern slavery there? So, and if you are going to guarantee that, tell us how you've done it. But the important thing is to be able to say, this is what we think we can do, and this is where we think we're going, and in the following year, to build on that. So it's not the be-all, end-all, that one particular report. We've also, of course, seen, sadly, the impact of some consultants and other organisations who are clearly just doing cut and paste jobs. So you read the same statement over and over, you know, with just a different company name in it, which is very poor. So what do we think should happen? Well, we think what should happen was, as I've already suggested, we need to strengthen legislation in a number of different ways. Key for me is incorporating public bodies, because I think that way we will have a huge impact on what happens in a wide range of sectors as a result of that. Now, not to say that that's easy, and of course we'll be following what colleagues have done elsewhere to make progress on this particular issue, and I would suspect that we'll have to produce specific guidelines for government bodies and public authorities and so on, in order to recognise the specificity of that particular sector as distinct from the private sector. We need to absolutely have effective monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, including possible naming and shaming, if not financial penalties. Other acts like the Bribery Act and gender pay gap, minimum wage, they all have mechanisms which kind of highlight the miscreants in those sectors, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't do the same with regard to this. So again, for government, I think clearer guidelines. There are some areas which are a little bit ambiguous, and collaboration with other jurisdictions. I think particularly for companies that work internationally across the different countries, to encounter lots of different kinds of legislation is not always terribly helpful. Am I coming to the end, Shamir? Is that what that sort? Oh, right. Oh, thank you. I thought you were giving me a subtle hint that I should finish. Yeah. No. Get this water down and get off. Okay. No. So for government, a number of things that I think they can do quite easily. They're not hugely difficult things to have to do. Thank you. And in fact, you know, as I've already said, we do have models that we could follow and build on to produce the kind of result we want to. For businesses, you know, pretty basic. Obey the law, ensure that statements are compliant. You'd be surprised that then maybe you wouldn't. Maybe some of you are implicated, but you know, there are a number of companies who don't, for example, get it signed off by the board. The whole point, this is about the whole organisation. It's not just about the person in CSR or the person in legal. The board have to have, and the whole company has to have buy-in to this reporting mechanism, and that needs to be demonstrated by a legible sign-off, and we're not seeing that, and we're not seeing it on home pages of websites, so it's not even accessible. So if you are a very diligent citizen and you want to chase up a particular company, how do you even find out where to find that company if you're not familiar with their work? So business, ensure statements are compliant, share knowledge and expertise within and across sectors. You know, there's lots going on in different sectors that can be applied across the board. And I think it's also very helpful in terms of helping companies to feel brave, if you like, to step up and not be too frightened about exposing some of the difficulties they have in their supply chains. I'm sure we can use digital technology much more efficiently. It's developing all the time, and there are lots of different ways in which that can be used to identify locations and working conditions and so on. So I think there's a number of things for government, for business, for NGOs to continue working with business in a constructive way, and also to collaborate with academics on really robust, rigorous evidence, because I think that's really important too. So I guess what I'd say in summary, that's my kind of wish list. I'm not quite sure if that's what Shamir wanted, but that's my kind of wish list for the very near future. We will see, as I say, with these reviews and the scrutiny that's going on, plus I think, I was saying yesterday, people are losing patience with companies, and I know from the calls I get from journalists and from NGOs, they're sort of champing at the bit, ready to have a deep look at some of our biggest companies and find out what it is they're doing in their supply chains. And if you've got a bland statement that says virtually nothing at all, actually that's the biggest risk of all. So I think for government, the way forward is clear. I hope that these interventions from the Home Affairs Committee and from the independent review will have a real impact on their thinking, and that shortly we'll see a massive increase in the quality and quantity of reports submitted. Thank you.